Okay, so in this last lecture, I want to say a little bit about evaluating premises. We've talked a lot about evaluating arguments. We've talked a lot about the form of deductive arguments, this concept of validity. We haven't said a lot about good premises or how to test them. A lot of that is because that's trickier, that's harder, right? And at least when it comes to moral premises, we're going to say a lot more about that as the course goes on, right? I'm not going to try to cover it in these introductory lectures because that's going to be the point of what we do the entire semester, right? But I think we should take a first pass at this, right? How do we evaluate premises, especially how do we evaluate moral premises and arguments? How do we evaluate moral arguments, in fact? Well, again, it's important to think about the structure or the form of moral arguments. Moral arguments will have moral premises and they'll have non-moral premises. And when we evaluate those premises, it's important to ask ourselves what kind of premise each one is. How we evaluate a premise, how we decide whether it's a good one or a bad one, depends on what kind of premise we have, right? If it's a non-moral premise, a non-moral premise is one that makes a sort of factual or descriptive claim. We will test that much differently than we test a moral premise, right? A moral premise being one that makes a moral claim. So let's just give you guys some examples of what I mean by this. Let's have an argument that has a moral premise and a non-moral premise. So here's our argument. Punishments are only just if they prevent crime. Studies have shown that the death penalty does not prevent crime. Therefore, the death penalty is not just. Two premises and a conclusion, right? What's our moral premise? What's our non-moral premise? Think about it a second. In live classes, I'll actually ask people to raise their hand on this one. It's funny, no one ever does, even though just if you were completely guessing, you would have a 50-50 shot, right? Well, eventually somebody will, if I wait long enough, but people are always hesitant. I'm like, come on, you just guess, you got a 50-50 shot, right? All right, so let's distill the argument. That'll maybe make it easier to pick out which is which. If a punishment does not prevent crime, it is not just. Studies show that the death penalty does not prevent crime, so the death penalty is not just. Premise, conclusion, right? First premise is our moral premise. If a punishment does not prevent crime, it's not just. Our non-moral premise is studies show that the death penalty does not prevent crime. Conclusion, the death penalty is not just, right? Look, not saying you have to agree or disagree with this argument, just give it as an example, right? So now that we've sorted out which premise is which, we can evaluate them, right? Now your non-moral premise, how would you evaluate this one? How would you decide whether it's true or not? Well, look, go find the studies on the death penalty, right? Go look, is what this argument says, is what this premise says true? I'll do a Google search, evidence of effectiveness of the death penalty, right? Or something else. I'll do a little research, see what the studies actually say on this. If they do in fact say it's not really a deterrent, it doesn't prevent crime, then the premise is true. If they don't say that, then it's not, right? It's a pretty simple matter for most non-moral premises, especially when they make a claim about facts, to settle whether they're true or whether there's at least evidence for them or not. Moral premises, it's not so easy. We can't just look at the facts. How do we evaluate them? We'll say more in a second. Now, our emphasis in this class is going to be evaluating moral theories and evaluating the moral premises they give us, so we'll focus more on that. But look, we do need to say a little bit about evaluating non-moral premises, right? So a few points on non-moral premises. If you use non-moral premises in your arguments, and you'll have to, if possible, they should not be controversial. What do I mean by controversial? Non-controversial is maybe the best contrast with this, right? When a principle or a premise is not controversial, not only are you very confident that it's true, you also think that the average person wouldn't object to it, right? The average person on the street, a random person that you pick, would accept your premise. That's what it means for a premise not to be controversial. If you think there's a good chance a random person would reject it, then it's controversial. It doesn't matter how sure you are of the principle, it is a controversial premise or principle. Anytime you have a controversial premise, you need to give evidence for it, right? When you're writing your case study responses or your final paper, if you make claims about the facts or other things, if somebody else might read your response and say, well, I'm not so sure, that you need to give some kind of evidence for that premise. You know, in one of our case studies in the future, there's a case where this policeman threatens to torture a suspect. It's a real case. And students will always make these claims about what the policeman must have been thinking. If they agree with his decision, it was heroic. If they disagree, he's a monster who just enjoys hurting people. And I always mark off for both of those, right? Because, like, you cannot guess, you cannot make claims about what this person is thinking without some kind of evidence, right? Don't do that. And, you know, to emphasize this over and over, in the modern world, when we have Google at our fingertips, there's really no excuse for not providing evidence for controversial claims. When you do provide evidence, use multiple sources. You know, look, if you look at 20 sources, you can probably find one that tells you what you want to hear. If the other 19 disagree with you, well, the fact you can find one that agrees with you, not very convincing, right? Use multiple sources if possible, and especially don't cherry pick a source that you think will agree with you. Finally, use reputable sources. You know, look, we all have some idea what are reputable sources and what aren't, right? You know, the National Enquirer is not a reputable source. The Weekly World News, I don't think the Weekly World News exists anymore. It was the one that gave us all those fun stories about Bat Boy, right? Weekly World News went out of business. When it did exist, it was not a reputable source, right? The Wall Street Journal is a reputable source. The Washington Post is a reputable source, right? You know, we can argue around the edges, but use reputable sources, right? Wikipedia, students love Wikipedia. I even start there a lot of times. Wikipedia kind of is in a gray area. It ain't the Weekly World News. It's also not the Washington Post or the Wall Street Journal or the Encyclopedia Britannica. Often Wikipedia is a decent place to start. Anything you find there, confirm in a more reputable source. You know, like the Encyclopedia Britannica, or for philosophy, the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy. Don't take Wikipedia as the gold standard, right? All right. But more importantly, how do we evaluate moral premises? How do we judge moral premises? How do we know whether they're good ones? The main way, we're going to do a lot of stuff with this, but one of the main ways is to ask ourselves, is it open to a counterexample? I'll talk in a minute what counterexamples are, but always when you make an argument with a moral premise, ask yourself, is it open to a counterexample? If it is, try to reformulate it in a way that it's not. Another one, we'll talk less about this today. This will be more important as we go forward and look at our moral theories. Does the premise explain our ordinary moral judgments? This will be even more important with moral theories. We'll talk about intuitions considered judgments. All that is just to say, fancy way of saying moral claims we're all pretty sure about. There are certain moral claims, not my example, I'm stealing it from this philosopher Elizabeth Anscombe, say it's wrong to boil a baby alive. Every sane, decent person agrees with that moral claim. Good moral principles, good moral theory should be able to explain those judgments we all agree on. We'll say more about that as we get into the theories. It's good to keep in mind, though. Let's just say a bit about counterexamples today. Here's an example of a moral premise, or an argument that uses a moral premise at least, that is open or vulnerable to a counterexample. Deliberately killing another human being is always wrong. Physician-assisted suicide involves deliberately killing another human being. So physician-assisted suicide is wrong. All right. Let's look at our argument. We can distill it, but we can also just tag our moral premises and our non-moral premises. Moral premise, deliberately killing another human being is always wrong. Non-moral premise, physician-assisted suicide involves deliberately killing another human being. Conclusion, physician-assisted suicide is wrong. All right. So a counterexample, try to think of a case where it wouldn't be wrong to kill another human being. The moral premise says it's always wrong to do this. So if we can think of a case where killing another human being is morally acceptable, that disproves this moral premise. Counterexample to the premise, the best one is probably it's morally acceptable to kill in self-defense, right? We can argue about what self-defense is, but in a clear case of self-defense, if the other person is an axe murderer, they are literally charging toward you with an axe, they're going to chop you to bits if you don't shoot them. Practically everyone would say it is morally acceptable to shoot the person, to kill the person in this case, right? So this is a counterexample to that moral claim, right? And I think it's worth, thinking a bit more about this, actually plugging in, seeing how the argument works, right? If killing another human being is always wrong, then killing in self-defense is wrong. Killing in self-defense is not wrong, so killing another human being is not always wrong. This is a valid argument, right? This is a valid argument that if the premises are true, the conclusion must be true as well, and the premises are likely true, right? Think about this for a second. What form of valid argument does this use? Well, it uses modus tollens, right? If A, then B, not B, so not A, right? If killing another human being always wrong, killing in self-defense would be wrong. If A, then B. Not B, right? It is not wrong to kill in self-defense, so not A, right? Counterexamples use this modus tollens form of argument. That's why they work, if they do work, to disprove the claim, the moral principle they're trying to disprove. Okay, so hopefully you guys are clear what a counterexample is. Now, this is important We'll use this idea of counterexamples when evaluating the moral theories, but it's also important when you respond to the case studies in this class, when you make arguments, you need to think about possible counterexamples to your claim. If possible, try to avoid basing your arguments on moral principles where there's an obvious counterexample. One other point here, how do we come up with a good counterexample? To work a counterexample, the other person has to admit the truth of the claim, right? This one works. This is a good counterexample because practically everyone will admit that it's morally acceptable to kill in self-defense, right? There are a few people who will reject this, but, they are just saints, right? Either they're saints or they're fools, I'm not sure which, but practically everyone else will say, yes, we might not like it, but it's morally acceptable to kill in self-defense, right? That's why this is a good counterexample. Now think of other counterexamples you might use to this argument, right? Or this moral premise. Deliberately killing another human being is always wrong. A counterexample some people in some of my classes will use is, well, killing a murderer as a, execution is not morally wrong. That's not as good a counterexample though, right? Why? Well, because a lot of people won't accept that claim, right? That's much more controversial. Practically everyone admits that it's morally acceptable to kill in self-defense. There are a lot more people who will reject the claim that executing a murderer is a morally legitimate thing to do, that that's a morally acceptable case to kill somebody. A good counterexample must be something the other person will accept. Also, a good counterexample generally has some distance from the case. If we're talking about physician-assisted suicide, your counterexample probably shouldn't make reference to physician-assisted suicide. Well, again, why? The other person must admit the truth of the claim. If they disagree with you on physician-assisted suicide, they're probably not going to agree with you in any counterexample that makes reference to it. Okay. Final point here. What do you do when your moral principle is open to a counterexample? There's 3 possible responses. You can give up the principle, just say, okay, I see that's false. You can the most common response is probably to reformulate the principle to avoid the counterexample, if you can do that. In our example, we might reformulate this principle to say, except for cases of self-defense, it is always wrong to kill another human being, right? That would avoid the counterexample. It's a better moral principle because it's not open to such an obvious counterexample. One final response to a counterexample is to bite the bullet. That's the jargon. Philosophers use the idea as biting the bullet. You think of these old westerns or Civil War films where somebody, they have gangrene in their leg and they're going to saw off their leg, right? They give them a bottle of whiskey, then they give them a bullet to bite on. The idea is this is very unpleasant, right? To bite the bullet means you accept the seemingly weird or bad results of your moral principle or your moral theory. Now we'll see this. All the moral theories we're going to look at, as I said, moral arguments are hard. All the moral theories we're going to look at are going to have some results that seem, at the very least, counterintuitive. And what the theories will try to do is to reformulate their principles or explain why the counterexample isn't a real counterexample. But in some cases, they will be stuck with them. They're going to have no option but to bite the bullet. We'll see some examples of this going forward. These are just your 3 responses when given a counterexample. Okay, So that is our introduction, our first pass at, evaluating arguments, this idea of making good arguments. We're going to say a lot more, especially when it comes to evaluating moral arguments. Just I want to take a first pass at this, give you guys a little bit of familiarity with it though.